The rain had stopped just as Margaret Chen pulled into the parking lot of the Grand Harbor Hotel. She sat in her old Honda for a moment, watching well-dressed people walk through the glass doors. Their clothes looked expensive. Their shoes clicked confidently on the wet pavement. She looked down at her own outfit and sighed. The navy blue dress had been her go-to for special occasions for the past 5 years. She had bought it at a department store sale, and while it was clean and pressed, it felt plain compared to what she saw around her. Margaret checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, tucked a strand of graying hair behind her ear, and grabbed her small purse. Just a few hours, she whispered to herself. For Lily. Her 15-year-old daughter had begged her to come to this fundraiser. Lily was part of the school choir, and tonight's event was supposed to raise money for new music equipment. Margaret worked at the Seattle Public Library downtown, checking out books and helping people find what they needed. The ticket to tonight's event had cost her nearly a week's worth of lunches, but seeing her daughter's excited face had made it worth it. The hotel lobby took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks. The marble floor reflected everything, making the space look twice as big. People stood around in groups, holding wine glasses and laughing. Margaret recognized some faces from school pickup, but these were the parents who drove luxury cars and lived in the big houses on the hill. She followed the signs toward the ballroom, her low heels making soft sounds on the marble. A woman in a black suit handed her a name tag that read Margaret Chen, parent, in neat printing. Margaret stuck it to her dress and tried to smile. The ballroom was even more impressive than the lobby. Round tables covered in white cloth filled the space, each decorated with fresh flowers that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. At the far end of the room, a stage held a magnificent black piano. It was the biggest piano Margaret had ever seen, its surface so shiny she could see the ceiling lights reflected in it. Margaret found her assigned table near the back. She was thankful for this. From here, she could watch everything without feeling like she was being watched back. The other seats at her table were empty for now. Most people were still standing around talking and drinking. She pulled out her phone and texted Lily. "I'm here. The piano is beautiful. Break a leg tonight." A few minutes later, her phone buzzed back. "Mom, take a picture. I want to see it." Margaret looked around, feeling awkward about taking photos, but she quickly snapped a picture of the stage and sent it. Almost immediately, Lily replied with heart eyes emojis. As Margaret put her phone away, people began taking their seats. A couple in their 50s sat down at her table. The woman wore a pearl necklace that caught the light every time she moved. The man's watch looked like it cost more than Margaret's car. "Beautiful evening for this," the woman said pleasantly. "I'm Patricia Williams. This is my husband, Robert." "Margaret Chen," she replied, shaking their hands. "My daughter Lily is in the choir." "How wonderful," Patricia said. "Our son graduated last year, but we still love supporting the music program." "Are you excited about tonight's special guest?" Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure who the special guest was. The invitation had mentioned a world-renowned pianist, but she hadn't had time to look up the details. More people filled the table. There was Dr. Martinez, who owned a dental practice, and his wife. There was also Mrs. Thompson, who Margaret remembered from a few school events. They all seemed to know each other well, talking about vacation plans and business deals. Margaret listened politely but felt like she was watching a movie about people very different from herself. When someone asked what she did for work, she simply said she worked at the library. They nodded and quickly moved on to other topics. The lights dimmed slightly and a man in a tuxedo stepped onto the stage. He had thick gray hair and spoke with confidence into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Lincoln High School's annual music fundraiser. Before we begin tonight's incredible performance, let me tell you what your generous donations will provide for our students." He talked about new instruments, updated sound equipment, and scholarships for talented students who couldn't afford private lessons. Margaret thought about Lily, who had been asking for piano lessons for years. Maybe if tonight raised enough money, the school could offer some kind of program. "And now," the man continued, "please join me in welcoming one of the world's most celebrated classical pianists. He has performed in concert halls across Europe and America. His recordings have won multiple awards. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor Petrov." The applause was thunderous. Margaret clapped along, watching as a man in his 50s walked onto the stage. He had dark hair with silver at the temples and carried himself like someone who was used to being the center of attention. He wore a perfectly fitted black suit and moved with the kind of confidence Margaret envied. Viktor Petrov bowed to the audience, then sat at the piano bench. He adjusted it slightly, flexed his fingers, and placed them on the keys. The room became completely silent. What happened next made Margaret forget about everything else. The music that filled the ballroom was unlike anything she had ever heard live. It was a piece by Rachmaninoff, though Margaret didn't know the name. She only knew that it was beautiful and complicated, and made her chest feel tight with emotion. Victor's hands moved across the keyboard like they were dancing. Sometimes they barely touched the keys, creating sounds as soft as whispers. Other times they struck with power that made the piano sing out over the entire room. Margaret found herself leaning forward, watching every movement. She had always loved music, especially piano music. As a young woman, she had taken lessons for a few years, but life had gotten in the way. Work, marriage, divorce, single motherhood. There had never been time or money to continue. But sitting here now, watching this master perform, she remembered how it felt to make music herself. The piece ended, and the room erupted in applause again. Victor stood and bowed, a satisfied smile on his face. He clearly enjoyed the attention and praise. "Thank you," he said into the microphone.
Music is a universal language that connects us all.
"Tonight, your support ensures that the next generation will have the chance to speak this language too." As the formal program continued and dinner was served, Margaret found herself glancing repeatedly at the piano. It sat there quietly now, waiting. She wondered what it would feel like to touch those keys, to make music on such a beautiful instrument. She had no idea that in just a few hours, she would find out. After Victor's performance, the dinner service began. Margaret picked at her chicken and vegetables while listening to the conversations around her table. People were talking about the pianist's technique, using words like virtuoso and masterful interpretation. She understood what they meant, but she kept quiet. In her experience, it was better to listen than to risk saying something that might sound foolish. The wine flowed freely at the other tables, and the room grew louder and more relaxed. Margaret stuck to water. She couldn't afford to let her guard down in a place like this, and besides, she had to drive home later. Viktor Petrov had left the stage but remained in the ballroom. Moving from table to table like a celebrity greeting his fans, he shook hands with the men and kissed the hands of the women in a way that seemed old-fashioned and theatrical. Margaret watched him work the room, noticing how people's faces lit up when he approached their tables. "He's quite charming, isn't he?" Patricia Williams whispered to Margaret. "My friend Linda met him at a concert in San Francisco last year. She said he was absolutely delightful." Margaret nodded politely. She had to admit that Victor knew how to command attention. Even from across the room, his presence was magnetic. But something about his smile seemed practiced, like he had performed this routine hundreds of times before. The speeches continued between courses. The school principal talked about test scores and college acceptance rates. The music director showed slides of students performing. Margaret smiled when she saw a photo of Lily singing in the spring concert. Her daughter looked so happy up there on stage. During dessert, Margaret excused herself to use the restroom. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter, and she took a moment to check her phone. Lily had texted, "How's it going? Did you get to meet the famous pianist?" Margaret typed back, "It's very fancy. Haven't met him, but he plays beautifully. You should talk to him. You know more about piano than most people there." Margaret almost laughed at that. While it was true that she had studied music in college and still played occasionally on the old keyboard in her apartment, she was hardly qualified to discuss technique with a world-class performer. When she returned to the ballroom, she noticed that Victor was getting closer to her section. He was currently at a table 2 rows ahead, telling what seemed to be an amusing story based on the laughter coming from his audience. Margaret had just sat down when she felt someone watching her. She looked up to see Victor standing near the stage, scanning the room. His eyes seemed to pause on her table, and she quickly looked down at her dessert plate. A few minutes later, the formal program ended and people began to mingle again. Some headed to the bar tea. Had it been set up in the corner, others gathered in small groups to continue their conversations. Margaret was considering whether she should stay or make a polite exit when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me." She turned to find Viktor Petrov standing right beside her chair. Up close, he was more imposing than she had expected. His eyes were a striking blue, and his smile was perfectly white. "I couldn't help but notice you during the performance," he said, his accent giving his words a formal quality. "You seemed quite absorbed in the music." Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "Oh, yes. It was beautiful. You're very talented." "Thank you." He pulled out the empty chair next to her and sat down without being invited. "I'm Victor, though I suppose you already know that. Margaret Chen." "And what do you do, Margaret?" "I work at the library downtown." Victor nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "How lovely. Books and music have so much in common, don't you think? Both require interpretation, understanding of rhythm and flow." Margaret wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she just smiled. "Tell me," Victor continued, leaning back in his chair. "Do you play at all?" The question caught her off guard. "Oh, a little. Nothing serious. Just for fun?" "Just for fun," Victor repeated, and something in his tone made Margaret look at him more carefully. How wonderful. So many people think music is only for the serious, the professionally trained. But really anyone can play, can't they? Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by play. "Oh, but that's exactly my point." Victor's voice grew louder, and Margaret noticed that people at nearby tables were starting to glance their way. Music should be accessible to everyone. Take piano, for instance. Really, how difficult can it be? You press the keys and sound comes out. Margaret felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but Victor wasn't finished. "In fact," he said, standing up and gesturing toward the stage, "I think we should demonstrate this. What do you say, Margaret? Would you show everyone how easy it is?" The question hit her like a cold splash of water. "What?" "The piano is just sitting there waiting to be played, and you seem like someone with music in your soul. I'm sure everyone would love to hear what you can do." Margaret looked around and realized that their conversation had drawn attention. At least a dozen people were now watching them, including everyone at her table. Some were smiling with anticipation as if they expected some kind of entertainment. "Oh no," Margaret said quickly. "I couldn't possibly. I'm not good enough for something like that." "Nonsense." Victor's voice boomed across the nearby tables. "Music is for everyone, remember? Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You hit a few wrong notes, we all have a good laugh, and life goes on." The way he said "good laugh" made Margaret's stomach twist. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't a genuine invitation. This was something else entirely. "Really, I don't think—" "Come now," Victor interrupted, his smile growing wider. "Don't be shy. I insist." More people were gathering around them now. Margaret could see Patricia Williams looking concerned, but others seemed amused by the spectacle. A few people had even started clapping encouragingly. "Yes, go on," someone called out. "Let's hear what you've got." "This should be interesting," she heard another voice say, followed by a stifled laugh. Victor extended his hand toward Margaret like a gentleman asking for a dance, but his eyes held a different message. This was a challenge, a test, and somehow she had become the unwilling participant in whatever game he was playing. Margaret's heart was pounding. Every instinct told her to refuse, to make some excuse and leave immediately. But she was surrounded now by expectant faces, and Victor's hand remained outstretched. The weight of all those eyes made it impossible to simply walk away. "I really don't think this is a good idea," she said one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Trust me," Victor replied, and his smile was so confident, so certain of how this would end, that Margaret finally understood exactly what was happening. She was about to be humiliated in front of a room full of people, and somehow she was going to let it happen. With trembling legs, Margaret stood up and took Victor's hand. Margaret's hand felt cold in Victor's warm grip as he led her toward the stage. Each step felt like walking through thick mud. The conversations in the room had mostly stopped, and she could hear the click of her low heels on the floor. Behind her, she heard someone whisper, "Is she really going to try to play?" The piano looked even more intimidating up close. Its black surface reflected the ballroom lights like a dark mirror. Margaret had played on upright pianos, old keyboards, and even a few baby grands, but nothing like this. This instrument probably cost more than she made in 3 years. Victor guided her to the piano bench with theatrical politeness. "Here we are," he announced to the crowd that had followed them. "Margaret from the library is going to share her musical talents with us." The way he said library made it sound like a punchline. A few people chuckled. Margaret sat down on the bench, her legs feeling weak. The keys stretched out in front of her like a row of white and black teeth. "Take your time," Victor said, stepping back but staying close enough that his voice would carry to the audience. "Remember, it's just for fun. No pressure at all." Margaret looked out at the crowd and immediately regretted it. There had to be at least 50 people watching now. Some looked curious, others amused. A few seemed genuinely interested in what might happen. But most wore the expressions of people waiting for a show they expected to be entertaining, for all the wrong reasons. She spotted Patricia Williams in the crowd, looking worried. Dr. Martinez had his phone out, probably ready to record whatever embarrassing thing was about to happen. Margaret's stomach churned. "Any requests?" Victor asked the audience with a grin. "Perhaps chopsticks?" Mary had a little lamb. More laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt heat rise up her neck and into her face. She looked down at the keys, trying to block out the voices around her. "Oh, I know," Victor continued. "How about heart and soul? I could play the duet part with you." The suggestion brought more chuckles. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to calm her breathing. In her mind, she could hear her old piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, saying what she always said before Margaret performed in student recitals. "The music is already inside you, dear. The piano is just how you let it out." Margaret had been 19 when she stopped taking lessons. Money had gotten tight and college was expensive. She had promised herself she would go back to music someday, but someday had never come. For the past 20 years, she had played quietly on a small keyboard in her apartment, usually late at night when Lily was asleep. She played mostly from memory, pieces she had learned years ago but never forgotten. "Whenever you're ready," Victor said, his voice dripping with false encouragement. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the keys again. Her hands were shaking, but she placed them gently on the keyboard anyway. The keys felt smooth and perfectly weighted under her fingers. For a moment, she considered playing something simple, something that would get this over with quickly and let her escape with minimal embarrassment. Fur Elise, maybe, or one of the easier Bach minuets. Something that would satisfy Victor's cruel game and let her disappear. But then something shifted inside her. Maybe it was 20 years of keeping quiet, of making herself small, of always choosing the safe path. Maybe it was the memory of all those nights when she had played beautiful music alone in her apartment, wondering what it would sound like on a real piano. Maybe it was just that she was tired of being underestimated. Margaret straightened her spine and positioned her hands properly over the keys. She took one last deep breath and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballad No. 1 filled the ballroom. Not the simple melody that everyone expected, but the full complex piece in all its technical glory. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with surprising confidence, creating the haunting opening theme that she had played thousands of times in the privacy of her small apartment. The change in the room was immediate. The chattering stopped completely. The laughter died. Even the sounds of people shifting in their seats faded away. Margaret kept her eyes on the piano keys, focusing entirely on the music. Her left hand established the gentle but intricate accompaniment, while her right hand carried the melody. Each note was clear and precise, but also warm with emotion. She could feel her confidence growing with every measure. Her hands remembered exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to use for each phrase. The muscle memory from all those late-night practice sessions came flooding back. Victor's expression had already started to change. The smug smile was slipping from his face, replaced by something that looked like confusion, then surprise, then growing alarm. Margaret reached the first technical passage, where the melody line began to include rapid runs and complex fingerwork. This was where most amateur players would stumble, where the piece would fall apart if you didn't really know what you were doing. Margaret didn't stumble. Her fingers flew over the keys with increasing speed and accuracy. The runs were crystal clear, each note distinct but flowing seamlessly into the next. Someone in the crowd made a small gasping sound. The librarian who had seemed so ordinary, so out of place just minutes before, was playing one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire, and she was playing it well. Victor took a step closer to the piano, his face now showing something close to shock. This was not what he had planned. This was not the embarrassing amateur performance he had expected to use as entertainment for the wealthy crowd. Margaret moved into the second theme of the ballade, her playing becoming more confident and expressive with each passing moment. She began to add her own subtle interpretive touches. A slight hesitation here, a gentle emphasis there. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was musical artistry. The audience was completely silent now. People who had been ready to laugh were instead leaning forward, captivated by what they were hearing. Dr. Martinez had lowered his phone, no longer interested in recording what he thought would be a humorous moment. Margaret's hands moved with increasing grace and power as she approached the ballade's more dramatic sections. The piano responded beautifully to her touch, its rich tone filling every corner of the ballroom. This was what the instrument had been built for, not to sit silently as decoration, but to sing. Victor was no longer smiling at all. He stood rigid beside the piano, watching Margaret's hands with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. How was this possible? Who was this woman? The first section of the ballade came to its conclusion, and Margaret transitioned seamlessly into the more complex middle section. Her left hand began the intricate accompaniment pattern, while her right hand prepared for the challenging passage work that would come next. She had never played this piece on a piano this responsive, this beautiful. Every nuance she had imagined during her solitary practice sessions was finally being heard exactly as she had dreamed it would sound. In the audience, Patricia Williams was staring with her mouth slightly open. The other parents at Margaret's table looked stunned. This was not the same quiet woman who had sat with them during dinner. Margaret felt 20 years of silence breaking free through her fingertips. Margaret moved deeper into the ballad's most challenging section, where Chopin had woven together melody and technical brilliance in a way that demanded both perfect finger control and deep emotional understanding. Her hands moved with increasing confidence across the keys, no longer the trembling hands of a nervous amateur, but the sure movements of someone who truly knew this music. The rapid octave passages began, and Margaret attacked them with a precision that made Victor take another step back. These were the sections that separated real pianists from people who simply played piano. Each octave had to be perfectly balanced, the melody line singing above the accompaniment, while maintaining the driving rhythm that pushed the piece forward. Margaret's left hand provided a rock-solid foundation, while her right hand danced through the complex figurations. She had practiced these passages thousands of times on her silent keyboard, imagining how they would sound on a real piano. Now finally hearing them ring out in full voice, she felt a joy she hadn't experienced in decades. In the audience, people were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mrs. Thompson, who had been ready to laugh at what she thought would be an amateur's fumbling attempt, now found herself with tears in her eyes. The music was not just technically impressive, it was deeply moving. Dr. Martinez had completely forgotten about his phone. He stood transfixed, remembering why he had loved classical music as a young man before life got busy with careers and mortgages and all the things that seemed important, until you heard something like this. Victor's face had gone through several changes. The smug confidence had disappeared first, replaced by surprise, then confusion, then growing amazement. Now he looked almost angry, not at Margaret, but at himself. How had he so completely misjudged this woman? How had he missed the signs that she was a serious musician? Margaret reached the ballade's emotional center, where Chopin's melody becomes almost conversational, as if the piano were telling a story of love and loss and hope. This was where technique alone wasn't enough. This section required a performer to dig deep into their own experiences and let that emotion flow through their fingers. And Margaret had experiences to draw from. 20 years of putting dreams on hold. 20 years of quiet sacrifice for her daughter's future. 20 years of playing beautiful music alone late at night, when no one could hear her pour her heart out through the keys. All of that longing, all of that suppressed passion, came flowing out now. The melody soared above the accompaniment with such poignant beauty that several people in the audience audibly gasped. Margaret wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was living them. Patricia Williams reached for her husband's hand without taking her eyes off the piano. She had attended dozens of professional concerts over the years, but she had never heard this ballade played with such raw emotion. The quiet librarian had transformed into something magnificent right before their eyes. The music built toward its first major climax, and Margaret's playing grew more powerful. Her whole body was involved now. leaning into the dramatic moments, her shoulders and arms working together to draw every possible drop of expression from the instrument. The piano responded like a living thing, its voice growing richer and more complex under her touch. Victor found himself studying Margaret's technique with the analytical eye of a professional. Her hand position was perfect. Her use of the pedals was sophisticated and musical. Her phrasing showed deep understanding of the composer's intentions, but also her own artistic voice. This wasn't the playing of someone who had learned a piece from YouTube videos or fake sheet music. This was the playing of someone who had studied seriously, who understood music from the inside out. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the ballroom. People had come over from the bar, from other conversations, drawn by the unexpected sound of masterful piano playing. Some were staff members from the hotel, others were parents from different tables. All stood in respectful silence, captivated by what they were hearing. Margaret moved into the final section of the piece, where Chopin brings back the opening theme but transforms it, making it more urgent, more dramatic. Her fingers flew through passages that would challenge professional concert pianists, but she made them sound effortless. Each note was placed exactly where it needed to be, with exactly the right amount of force and feeling. The emotional intensity continued to build. This was where the ballad told its complete story, where all the themes came together in a way that could break your heart if you really listened. Margaret was really listening, and she was making sure everyone else heard it too. Victor realized that he was watching something he might never see again. It wasn't just that Margaret was playing difficult music well. It was that she was playing it with the kind of passion and understanding that couldn't be faked or learned from books. She was a real musician, possibly a great one, and somehow she had been hiding in plain sight, working at a library, unknown to the classical music world. The final dramatic section approached, where the piece builds to its overwhelming climax. Margaret's playing became even more intense, her whole being focused on drawing every possible ounce of meaning from Chopin's masterpiece. The piano sang and thundered under her hands, filling the ballroom with sound so rich and powerful that it seemed to make the air itself vibrate. People in the audience weren't just listening anymore. They were experiencing something transformative. Several were openly crying. Others stood with their mouths open in amazement. A few had closed their eyes and were simply letting the music wash over them. This was why classical music existed. Moments like this when technical mastery and deep emotion came together to create something that touched the very core of what it meant to be human. Margaret was giving them all a gift, sharing something precious and rare that most of them had never expected to encounter. In a hotel ballroom at a school? Fundraiser. Victor felt something he hadn't experienced. In years of performing for wealthy audiences and recording for major labels, he felt humbled. This woman, who he had tried to embarrass and humiliate, was showing him what music could really be when it came from the heart instead of the ego. Margaret approached the final blazing climax of the ballade. Her hands moved with incredible speed and precision through the most technically demanding passages Chopin had ever written. But more than that, she played them with such conviction, such absolute commitment to the music that every person in the room felt they were witnessing something sacred. The melody soared one last time, transformed and triumphant, before the piece began its final descent toward the conclusion. Margaret's face showed complete absorption in the music. She was no longer in a hotel ballroom surrounded by people who had expected to laugh at her. She was in the place where music lives, where technique and emotion and pure artistic truth come together. As the final measures approached, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Everyone knew they were hearing something special, something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Margaret's fingers struck the final chord of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and the sound hung in the air like something magical. For a moment that felt like forever, the ballroom was completely silent. The last notes faded away slowly, and Margaret finally lifted her hands from the keys. She sat perfectly still, almost afraid to look up at the audience. Her heart was pounding, but not from nervousness anymore. It was from the pure joy of having played that piece the way she had always dreamed it could sound. On this beautiful piano in this acoustically perfect room, every note had rung out exactly as she had imagined during all those quiet nights practicing alone. Then the silence broke. The applause started with one person, then another, then suddenly the entire ballroom erupted. It wasn't polite cocktail party clapping. This was thunderous, sustained applause that seemed to go on and on. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, whistling, some even calling out bravo. Margaret finally looked up and saw a room full of faces that looked completely different than they had 20 minutes ago. These weren't people who had come to watch her fail. These were people who had just witnessed something extraordinary and knew it. Patricia Williams was crying openly, still clapping with tears streaming down her cheeks. Dr. Martinez was shaking his head in amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Mrs. Thompson had her hand over her heart and kept saying, "Oh my goodness," over and over. But it was Victor's face that surprised Margaret the most. The famous pianist stood right beside the piano, and his expression was unlike anything she had seen from him all evening. Gone was the arrogant smile, the condescending tone, the cruel amusement. Instead, he looked stunned, humbled, and maybe even a little ashamed. The applause continued for what felt like several minutes. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, her legs still shaky, but now from adrenaline rather than fear. She had never experienced anything like this. In all her years of piano lessons and student recitals, she had never played for an audience this size or received a response this enthusiastic. When the clapping finally began to die down, Victor stepped forward. His usual theatrical confidence was gone, replaced by something much more genuine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "I owe everyone here an apology, but especially Margaret." The room grew quiet again, everyone listening intently. "I thought I was being clever earlier," Victor continued, looking directly at Margaret. "I made assumptions about someone based on appearances, based on prejudices I didn't even know I had. I expected to provide you all with some light entertainment at this woman's expense." Margaret felt her face flush, but Victor wasn't finished. "Instead, I have just heard one of the most beautiful, most technically accomplished performances of Chopin's First Ballade that I have encountered in my 30 years as a professional musician." "Margaret, where on earth did you learn to play like that?" All eyes turned back to Margaret. She cleared her throat nervously before speaking. "I studied music in college," she said quietly. "Piano performance major at the University of Washington. But I had to stop when I got pregnant with my daughter. Single mom, you know. Had to find work that paid the bills." "But you kept playing?" Victor asked. "At home. Late at night mostly, on a little keyboard so I wouldn't wake Lily. I couldn't afford a real piano, but I never stopped loving the music." Victor was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see him processing this information. 20 years, he said finally. "You've been playing pieces like this for 20 years alone with no one to hear you?" Margaret nodded. Victor turned to address the crowd again. "This is exactly what I was talking about earlier, when I said music should be accessible to everyone. But I had it backwards. I was thinking about making music simpler, easier. What Margaret has shown us tonight is that the music is already there, in people we might never suspect, waiting for the right moment to emerge." He turned back to Margaret. "I have a recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon. I perform with major symphonies around the world, and I can tell you honestly that what you just played was better than most performances I hear from my professional colleagues." Margaret felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. "I would like to make you an offer," Victor continued. "I know people at the conservatory, faculty who remember what it's like to discover genuine talent. Would you be interested in completing your degree? I can make some calls, help arrange scholarships, maybe even some performance opportunities to help with expenses." The room buzzed with excited whispers. Margaret just stared at Victor, trying to process what he was saying. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," called out someone from the audience. Soon other voices joined in. "Say yes. Do it. You have to." Patricia Williams stepped forward from the crowd. "Margaret, honey, if you're worried about work, the library board would be crazy not to give you leave for something like this." "I happen to know several board members personally." Dr. Martinez spoke up next. "My wife and I would love to sponsor you in some way." That was the most incredible thing I've ever heard. More offers came from around the room. Someone mentioned knowing the director of the Seattle Symphony. Another person talked about connections at the local classical radio station. It seemed like everyone wanted to help make this opportunity possible. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the kindness, but also by the magnitude of what was being offered. Go back to school? Perform publicly? These were dreams she had buried so long ago that she had forgotten they were dreams at all. Her phone buzzed in her small purse, and she looked down to see a text from Lily. Mom. Jenny's mom just called her from the fundraiser and told her what happened. Is it true? Did you really just blow everyone's mind? I'm so proud of you. Reading her daughter's words, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. For 20 years, she had made every decision based on what was safe, what was practical, what would provide security for Lily. But Lily was 15 now, almost grown. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to show her daughter what it looked like when someone chose to follow their dreams instead of just survival. Margaret looked up at Victor, then at the crowd of people who were all watching her expectantly. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I would like that very much. The applause started again, even louder than before. But this time Margaret wasn't surprised by it. This time she smiled. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many stopped to speak with Margaret personally. They shook her hand, asked for her contact information, and told her how much her performance had moved them. Several mentioned that they would never listen to classical music the same way again. Victor stayed until nearly everyone had gone. Before he left, he handed Margaret his business card. I meant everything I said tonight, he told her. I'll start making calls tomorrow. The world needs to hear you play. Margaret drove home in a daze, Victor's card in her purse and her daughter's excited text lighting up her phone. As she pulled into her apartment complex parking lot, she realized that her life had just changed completely. Tomorrow, she would still be Margaret Chen, librarian. But she was also Margaret Chen, pianist. And for the first time in 20 years, she couldn't wait to see what came next.